chapter 1 of Galatians. And so far, just a quick recap, we've seen that the Galatians had deserted. I was making sure I didn't do something wrong. You're getting the hook like the Gong Show, which is quite possible. What'd you say? If we can't laugh at ourselves, then, So the Galatians had deserted Christ and God for what? That Paul describes it in verse 6 there. Another gospel, which is a lie, basically. Promoting keeping the law, circumcision, adding that to being saved through Christ and through him alone. And Paul associates the gospel and the gospel that he received very closely with his own apostleship. I think for him, they're so closely knit together that you can't really separate them. And so he spends much of the time in chapters 1 and 2, first and foremost, defending the gospel that he preached. And then secondary to that, it's defending his apostleship and who he got his apostleship from. He's absolutely convinced about the gospel that he received was the only way to God and salvation. And he recounts his history of his conversion, his early years of his life as an apostle, and his lack of interaction in a way with the apostles and the other Christians in Judea specifically. And so we're seeing that in chapter 1 and then on into chapter 2. So we saw him, he was converted, he went away to Arabia and then back to Damascus, and then he recounts a first trip to Jerusalem where it was after 3 years. And who did he spend some time with there? And it was only for 15 days, so just like barely over 2 weeks. And again, I think that he's trying to show some separation between himself and the apostles and those people in Jerusalem. And then as we come here in chapter 2, it's another interval of 14 years. So in chapter 2, first one says, after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. So just real quickly, so there's a little bit of debate, and I'll just bring this up. We'll briefly talk about this on which trip that he's talking about when he goes to Jerusalem. If you read through Acts, there's really two options that there for when he goes up to Jerusalem this time. Anybody know which two trips those would be? Well, there's Acts 11, which is what happens in Acts 11. Y'all remember Acts 11, there toward the end of Acts 11, 27 to 30. Yes, the gift. And so what's some of the context on that? What is that gift? It's money, right? And it's because of the famine that's about to go on. Because in Acts 11, 27, now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them named Agabus stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief to the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. So Paul, Saul, and Barnabas, they go to Jerusalem here in Acts chapter 11 because of the famine relief is what we generally will call that. And so that trip ends there in chapter 12. They return back to Antioch. And then what would the other option for this trip be from the book of Acts? If you just reading through the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 15, what's going on? And that's all over what? What prompts that? The trip to Jerusalem when he meets with the pillars. Yeah, some men came down from Judea, and they were saying that, you know, you had to be circumcised. And so they go up, they send Paul and Barnabas back to Jerusalem. And initially, Paul and Barnabas, they have a lot of debate with them. They go to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders, and they address this question. And then while they're there, they come to the conclusion, everybody does, that circumcision is not necessary for salvation. And at the end of that meeting or that council, what happened? What was they concluded that, but what did they do?
They determined things that were necessary for Paul and Barnabas to preach, and the things that weren't, they sent it as white.
And with them, they sent a letter, if you remember. Were you going to say something, Brett? I thought you had your hand up like you were about to say this. Oh, okay. Yeah, so they sent a letter with them. And one of the things that in the letter, it said that first it assured them that the people that came weren't really sent from James, I believe is what it says. And then the letter describes and in details that salvation is not through circumcision, but it's through Christ. So there's some, there's arguments for both of these. And, just some of and I think I indicated a couple of weeks ago that I feel like it's probably more this from Acts chapter 11, because it just makes more sense to me for a few reasons, because they sent a letter with them, and that's not, you would assume that Paul would have just referred to this conclusion with this letter that was made. It says also that he went up because of a revelation. We saw in Acts 11 the prophets that came down talking about this famine, and so I kind of think they tie together. And here in Galatians 2, what we'll see in a minute, it says Titus is not compelled to be circumcised, and we also see that there were people there at this point in time on this trip that were trying to pressure this for him to be circumcised. But in Acts chapter 15, that's not really apparent that there's the pressuring going on. It's mostly this discussion. In Galatians 2, there's a meeting that's done in private. And then also, but in Acts chapter 15, it's a public meeting. And then at the end of Galatians 2, at the end of this trip, they say to remember the poor, which I think in context with the trip in Acts chapter 11, it kind of speaks to that, because the purpose of that was for relief for people, and specifically monetary wise. And I also feel like that in this, Paul's whole point in this discussion that he's having here in Acts or in Galatians 2 is he's been carefully chronicling his interaction with the Christians in Jerusalem and the other apostles. And so I don't think he would have left a trip out, because I think that maybe would have been an opportunity for somebody to maybe try to shoot holes in what he was trying to say. Any thoughts on any of that? I don't know. I think most commentators that I've read would say that it's Acts 15, and I don't know. I've read some of their arguments and their reasons, and I've read the others, and the Acts 11 just makes more sense to me. What are some of the things that you all have studied and learned over the years that had to add to that? If you disagree with my conclusion, that's okay, because I didn't, I pour concrete for a living, so.
I mean, in Galatians 2, he says we went up because of a revelation. And in Acts 15, it says that they made arrangements for Paul and Barnabas to come. So it's not that they necessarily exclude one another, but it makes sense.
Yeah, and that's when I read through it, it just makes sense, and I guess that's all I can say. And where we're sitting in history, we see the whole New Testament. It may be which trip it is doesn't matter as much, but if you think about where they were receiving it, it may have been more significant because, like I said, Paul's building this case, and they maybe would have been able to shoot holes in it if he just kind of overlooked. They could have been like, well, you didn't mention that trip, and maybe something happened that we needed to know about. But anyway, I do think that that's probably that Acts 11 trip. But I just wanted to mention that because, there is some discussion back and forth, and I just feel like it'd be just good to go ahead and address that straight up front. So if nothing else on that, let's look at the first few verses here. Well, before we start, last time I mentioned what I felt like was a fine line that Paul kind of walks in some of his discussion about, the other apostles, and just some of the awkward language maybe. Y'all remember me mentioning that? So we had two things. He's walking two sides of this line, so to speak. On one hand, Paul wants to do what towards the apostles? He's trying to show them respect, but they're saying that they came before him, and he doesn't want to like undermine them as apostles or their work. But what's the other thing that he's trying to do? He's trying to show them respect, and then he's trying to distance himself from them somewhat, and the church there in Jerusalem, because he wasn't commissioned to be an apostle or sent by that church or even by the other apostles. And because he's been very adamant about when it comes to his apostleship and his gospel, he's been adamant about where did it come from? And not who. Yeah, from God, not men. And so we see here right here again in verse 2, some of that fine line language. So let's look one. So then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. And it was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. Now, I have a New American Standard here. It says went in private to those who are of reputation. Does anybody else's Bible say anything in front of reputation? Because suppose, okay, so when I read my ESV at home, I have an ESV I read a lot on my iPad, and it says seemed influential or supposed. What does that seem to kind of like have I don't know if I would say a negative connotation, but it throws a little something in there, awkward, right? And so I think that this is a distancing remark. Do y'all see that? And so he's trying to distance himself, and he's saying he went to them and they seem to have influential, and he's kind of like, I'm not falling all over them myself, and I'm no slouch either. I kind of feel like he's saying. So on one hand, he's saying he's distancing himself, but then on the other hand, I feel like in this verse we see that he shows respect. And how do you think he shows respect? Or do you agree? Does he show respect to him in any way here in this verse? Because why does he go into him? Eddie?
Like you said, I submitted the gospel that I preached. It's essentially he was telling them what he was preaching. Not for them to sit in judgment of, because that, be very clear that he's not doing that. But what he is doing is letting them know this is the message that I have been preaching.
And I guess there's a couple of things. He wants to make sure that's the same as his, right? I would think. And then another thing is, I think we see based on something he says, there's actually an end reason why he says that, why he says he goes to them. What's the last phrase in verse 2? He's trying to confirm something for himself in a way. For fear of what? That he had been running in vain. So would you call that an analogy? I'm not an English person. The whole running. He uses this analogy in other places. And when I think about some of the times he uses that analogy of running, like there's one in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, specifically, it's talking about how he's living his life in accordance with God's will and leading to salvation. Is how I see that. I don't know if that makes sense to everyone, but I don't know that that's necessarily what he's talking about here. Because I don't know that it doesn't seem like he's worried about that because I've said he's already established that he has full confidence in the gospel. So I don't think he's worried about that he's living his life in a way that would be inconsistent with God's will. What could he possibly be, this fear of running? What would that be?
One of the things Paul emphasizes over and over, we are one Christ. And so part of it is the unity, that we are one new man. There's no more Jew or Gentile, male or female, etc. So one of the things Paul can't allow to happen is you've got Jewish Christians and you've got Gentile Christians, and never shall the two meet. So I think that's one of the things he wants to establish, is that his teaching is consistent not only with truth, but he's on the same page with the Jews who have been converted. Because he has this Passover for one man in Christ.
So that's pretty much where I was going, but it was a different path. So when you think about the running is his work, would you all agree to that? His running is the work. It's the verb there. It's his work that he's doing. And Paul's work that he's been doing is teaching this gospel that he received, which is a gospel of Jews and Gentiles having a common salvation. And so the in vain part, is he wasting his time? I mean, that's where because I've kind of read this and I've been like, what does he mean? He's wasting, because that's what I feel like in vain sometimes, wasting time. So what would him verifying his gospel that he preached with the apostles and his work as in doing this, how would that be in vain? Potentially. Think about it like this. This is kind of the conclusion that I've come up to. Let's see, make sure. So if he goes there and he presents to them the gospel that he's been preaching and the work, which is the work he's been doing, and they disagree with him, and they're like, we're not really on the same page as you. If that message gets out that they're in disagreement, it could potentially unravel every bit of work that Paul's done in the teaching of the Gentiles. Yes, sir.
I agree with you. I think we can even focus on one particular aspect of that, because I think the greater context here of Galatians 2, is this idea that the gospel for the Gentiles is the same gospel for the Jews. And I think that in that context, I think that's why Paul had gone to the apostles to kind of confirm that circumcision is not necessary for salvation. The Gentiles don't have to accept the old law, that they're in fact all one together in Christ. And so that's what he's kind of starting with, to say, I went and talked with the apostles to make sure that we're in agreement on this. And then I think the rest of the context is to talk about how that, even though they were in agreement, there were others. He talked about in Paul's verse 4, the false brethren, who were sneaking in essentially to try to teach something different. And I think what he's trying to show is that he and the apostles in Jerusalem had a united front against these false brethren.
Yeah, and I guess maybe to go along with that is when he went there, I don't think he was going to get their approval for his gospel. I think he was going to make sure that they were all on the same page. And one of the things I wrote down here somewhere is, how do you think Paul would have reacted if they hadn't been on the same page? Would he have changed his gospel? Would he have quit? No, I think he would have just gone that much harder, probably. Yes, sir.
Says he withstood Peter to his face because he was wrong. So I mean, Paul was not a pushover.
And that was even after, they had all kind of been harmonious. What's that, Brett?
That starts at verse 11. Same chapter.
Yeah, and if we have time, we'll get to that today. I don't know if we will or not, because we'll just see. So let's see how far we've made it. I wrote this down so he wasn't trying to make sure he was preaching the same thing as them. He was, as much as anything, trying to make sure they were saying the same as him. Do you see the difference there? He wanted to make, because he had complete confidence in his gospel. So he was trying to just confirm that they were in agreement with him in a way. So let's see. I think that's through verse 2. Okay. And so I was trying to work through that whole in vain, running in vain. And that was the conclusion I came to. And hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Okay. So in verse 3, but not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. I guess at this, right here, before we even really go any further, I feel like it's kind of important, because if you read the Bible, you'll notice that there's another instance where Paul has somebody circumcised. And for the sake of just like defending any kind of inconsistency, I think it's probably a good idea just to address that just for a minute. What is the other instance that I'm referring to? Who did he have circumcised? Timothy, and I think that was in Acts chapter 16. And so how can Paul do two different things, completely opposite things, or endorse two completely different things and not be contradicting himself? And I think really the answer to that is just the context of the two situations. So here in Galatians, and on this trip to Jerusalem, as we about to see in verse 4, and somebody mentioned a second ago, there's false brethren that are there trying to spy. So they sneaked in, trying to spy out the liberty. So there's for Paul, so there's people that are pushing circumcision, part of salvation. And so for Paul to have allowed Titus or endorsed him to be circumcised, what would that have done ultimately? When you think about the big picture of the gospel, his work, would that have undermined the gospel, or would it have promoted the gospel to allow circumcision in that circumstance?
Easily undermined.
Yeah, I mean, the gospel message is in Christ there's salvation, and for him to even allow, and that's why he says there in verse what verse is it? They didn't yield in subjection, verse 5. They, not even for a second is it possible that they can allow circumcision in this situation, because it would have just totally taken Christ out of that as that cornerstone, and the whole thing would have just collapsed, basically. Yes.
The key word there is compelled. When man is trying to compel someone else, they're trying to take the position of God. God is the only one who has the right to compel. And so when these people were trying to compel Titus to be circumcised, they were putting themselves in the place of God, and Paul says, no, we're not going to yield to that for a second. The Acts 16 situation is entirely different. Nobody was compelling Timothy.
Okay, let's talk about the Acts 16 then. So you said no one is compelling Timothy. What's going on there in Acts chapter 16? This is, and actually, chronologically, this is after Acts 15. My math will add that up real pretty quick. Yes, this is after Acts 15, when, in my opinion, the whole circumcision debate is settled, regardless if you think it's what he's referring to here or not. Circumcision is settled at that point. So Paul does have Timothy circumcised, and when you think about, they were going on their preaching, and where would they usually go when they would go preaching in towns, from town to town? Where would they end up usually first? They would go into synagogues. And actually, one of the things I wanted to say too is back in Galatians 2, it says they came in to spy out the liberty. So we've talked a little bit about liberty in 1 Corinthians. And so in this instance, I think liberty would be the fact that they have the freedom to be circumcised or not be circumcised. And so even there in Acts chapter 16, Timothy has that liberty to be circumcised or not circumcised. Even though, so the Jews, they knew that Timothy was half Greek, half Jewish. And so no one's compelling Timothy to be circumcised, as Eddie said there a second ago. But what does Paul's conclusion come to about whether he needs to do and why? He needs to be circumcised, but why, I guess, is the question.
You mentioned earlier 1 Corinthians 9, and I think that's a great example of that, where Paul felt like that Timothy would be more effective in proclaiming this message to Jews for them to become Christians if Timothy was in fact circumcised as he's presenting this message to them.
Yeah, because it removed that whole that was a hindrance, something that they had to maybe get past, I guess you could say.
In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul talked about the fact that to the Jew I became as a Jew, to the Greek I became as a Greek, to the weak I became weak, to the strong I became strong. He did all things by all means to save some. And I think Acts 16 is a classic example of it.
Yeah, I was actually going to, bring that exact thing up, how he became all things to all people. And it was, the end result was the furtherance of the gospel, the benefit of the gospel, and more souls being brought to Christ. David, did you have your hand up?
I studied those.
Okay, so you're saying it says that maybe he was like telling people not to have their children circumcised, is what the note says there. And really, that doesn't have anything to do with salvation. So why would he necessarily wade into that? You would have to ask yourself, Okay. But I guess my point is, in both of these cases, with Titus and with Timothy, two exact opposite outcomes. One ultimate outcome, the gospel was for the betterance of the gospel. Betterance is a word, but for the betterment of the gospel. And it was benefited that way. So as we see here back in Galatians 2, Titus is not circumcised. Even though he was a Greek, he wasn't compelled to be circumcised, as we said. Any other thoughts on that whole Timothy Titus discussion? Now, as we've already kind of alluded to, verse 4 is because of false brethren who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. So in this verse, I think Paul brings up two things, liberty and bondage, that he will further develop later on as he builds his case against this false doctrine. And that is the two principles of liberty or freedom and bondage. And it's a really interesting discussion in chapter 4, which we'll look at about that same thing, freedom and liberty and bondage between Sarah and Hagar, which I think actually that little excerpt is my favorite part of this whole book, because it just like shakes up the whole thought process of the Jews and just turns it upside down. And I've always been fascinated by that. I don't know, can't really put my finger on it, but we'll look at that. But he brings these two principles of liberty and bondage up. Any thoughts on that? What anybody's read or heard? Okay, and then at verse 5, we've discussed this a little bit. We did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. So, again, Paul is uncompromising. He's not willing to even entertain the thought of this for just a moment. And it says that it's so that the truth of the gospel is preserved for the Galatians, or, Gentiles in general. All right, let's see. Okay, verse 6. But from those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. Who's he talking about there when he says those of high reputation or reputation? Yeah, exactly, the apostles. And so we see here that I wrote down, he's not on a fine line. He's almost on a tightrope at this point, the way he's describing them, high reputation. What do you suppose he means when he says that they added nothing to him?
His message was what it was, whether the apostles endorsed it or not.
Yeah, because we kind of discussed that. He wasn't going to give up on his message, was he? So yeah, they didn't add anything to his gospel. Did they make him more of an apostle by agreeing with him? No, they didn't. It didn't affect any of that stuff. And ultimately, I kind of feel like, what is it? All that matters is what in this verse? Who says? Who adds to Paul's gospel and his apostleship, so to speak? God shows no partiality, I think. So God is the only one that really matters. What he thinks or what he says. It's all that matters what God says. Okay. Any thoughts on that? On verse 6? All right, let's look at verses 7 and 8. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised, effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. So I guess I was thinking about this. So Paul has been, I guess, combating this false idea about his and really a bad attitude toward his gospel and toward him as an apostle that was kind of being pushed onto the Galatians. And we see him using this, awkward language, talking about the apostles. And so one of the questions I was just thinking for myself is like, do you think the apostles had the same attitude that he's addressing, this negative attitude? Yeah, I don't think so. They didn't, because they didn't feel the same way as what these false teachers were promoting in this attitude, because it says there in verse 17, talking about, I don't think that they felt like they would have added anything to his ministry or his gospel, his apostleship. And it says, on the contrary, seeing that I've been trusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. So they realized that Paul had been entrusted with the gospel. And they could see that it was evident who was working through him. Just like that same, God was working through Peter, and they realized that. Yes.
And I think this goes back to what he said back in verse 2, where he submitted to them the gospel that he preached. I think this was really kind of a meeting so that all the disciples would know that all of the apostles are together. That hadn't been. Paul was in Asia Minor or up in Syria. He was preaching the gospel there. They're hearing the message and they're hearing reports about it. But when he comes back to Jerusalem and he's meeting with the apostles and he's submitting to them, this is the gospel that I'm preaching. And the apostles essentially recognize that it's the same gospel they're preaching. And that's why he talks about here the right hand of fellowship. This was a very public declaration that we are all one. And that our message is the same. And these disciples are all the same. it was very important for the outward manifestation of unity, which already existed in the mind of God. And I think even existed among the apostles, but now it's something that's being made evident to all of the Christians, that we are indeed one.
And so when you consider the fact that it was after at least 14 years that Paul had become an apostle and become a Christian, that gives an opportunity for false teachers to try to spread this idea of disunity, maybe. And so by coming together and all being in agreement, they put all that to side, is that what you're kind of, is it?
Yeah, I think it really is just kind of a public acknowledgement of that which already existed.
No, I would agree with that, because I don't think for a minute, and I asked that question about if the apostles had that attitude, really is just more of a thought-provoking thing, because I think that they all were given the gospel by God, by Christ, the same gospel, and they all had the same purpose in mind. And even though they hadn't met and all got together on it, I think that was just a fact. That's the way it was. Okay, so moving on to verse 9, in kind of tying it together, them seeing that Paul had been entrusted with the gospel, it says that in recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the uncircumcised. It says recognizing the grace. So I was thinking about this. What does it, if I say I would recognize something, what does that imply automatically? Like if somebody walks in the door and I recognize them, what does that mean, you think? It means I know them. I've seen them before. If I see somebody going through a hard time, maybe, and I see the anguish that they're in and I recognize that, maybe it's because I know that. I've been through that. And so when it says that they recognize the grace given to Paul, what do you think he means by that? How were they able to recognize that? They understand it. How come though? They had experienced it. And so what they could see. Okay. They've seen it through watching their whole group. Okay. So they've seen evidence of his salvation, his apostleship, his work, maybe his working of miracles and his preaching, because they had experienced that same thing. That's how they were able to recognize. Does that make sense a little bit at all? And that's kind of, I think, a little bit goes back to what Eddie was saying is, they all had the same thing. They just hadn't talked about it yet. But they were able to recognize it based on, evidence that they saw and what they had experienced. And so I just, when I saw that, recognize the grace, it's because they had experienced those exact same things. And so we see, because of that understanding and that recognition, they're able to extend fellowship to Paul and Barnabas. Let's see. One of the things that, for me, when I hear the word fellowship, the very first word that comes up to me is sharing. And that, I know that's not like a full encompassing definition, but for me, it's just sharing. That's one of the main things I think of. So what are they sharing in? What fellowship do they have with Paul? These apostles.
I think when you tie in verse 9 into this idea, what they're sharing in is God's power, God's word. It's interesting in verse 9, mine has in parentheses, it's almost as if it's a throwaway statement, but to me it's a very, very powerful message. It says, he who effectively worked. And what that means is God is the one to use Peter. Really very crazy. God is the one who enabled Peter to work out the gospel to the Jews. And God is the one who enabled Paul to proclaim this same gospel to the Gentiles. And so in both cases, it emphasizes it's God's power that's doing this. And he used Peter to one group, he used Paul to another group, and he did the exact same thing with both of them. So their fellowship is they're both sharing in the power of God as they're proclaiming this message to two disparate groups.
Okay. So they're sharing in the power of God, and they're also sharing in the work that they're doing to these two groups, I guess you could say. So their work in sharing the gospel, their work as apostles, and they recognize that, Paul and Barnabas are to the Gentiles, and the others are to the Jews. I think, in fellowship and in sharing, to me, when you work with somebody towards a goal, you really, think about when the Israelites came back and they rebuilt the wall or they rebuilt the temple. They had a purpose, a sharing, and a goal. And, there's just something to be said about that. And to me, so when we work as towards a goal together and we share in that, there's a lot to be said. Okay, so any thoughts on that? I just think that fellowship is more than just, us all being on the same page. We've really got to be working together. There's emphasis on working, and I'm trying not to preach, but that's just my opinion. All right, verse 10. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. As I said earlier, I think this kind of, if we say that it is Acts 11, it kind of speaks to the trip that was there, remembering the poor. And so that was the end result of that meeting. I don't know if we want to really go into the conflict with Peter. I know the first bell just rang. We may just end up finishing there. Let's see. I maybe could have. So I'm not going to be here next week. Dad's gonna, he's going to teach. So I guess I'll tell him we got to there, and we'll pick up there next week. Thank you all for your comments. I appreciate it.